Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications with the National Association for Business Economics. We're excited about today. Glad that you all can make it. Before we start, I did want to mention a few upcoming events. Of course, the NABE Tech Economics Conference is coming up in just a few short weeks, arranged around the theme Economics in the Age of Algorithms, Experiments, and AI. This will be November 8th through 9th, and this will be an entirely virtual event. We do have our NABE Industry Job Fair, which is a component of the tech conference. We have these employers scheduled to participate. And if you are a PhD candidate or are entering the job market before June 2022, you can upload your resume on econjobs.org to receive a free registration for the conference. Keep in mind that the deadline is today for this offer. So please go to econjobs.org and upload your resume to get a free registration. We have a number of certified business economist courses. This is our certification in applied econometrics and data analytics. We have machine learning and data science for economists on November 15th through 18th, and time series analysis and forecasting taking place December 7th through 9th. Okay, on to today's event. We will have Q&A open throughout today's discussion. Feel free to drop your question into the Q&A box at any time. We do have some slides accompanying today's event, and we will be posting a link in the chat box to those slides. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Ida Johnsson is Senior Economist Forecasting and Risk with Zillow. Ida, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Kelsey O'Connor from Static Research and IZA, who will give us a presentation about tweets and well-being. So yeah, it's all yours, Kelsey, and we'll leave time for questions at the end, but also if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask them.
Yep, thank you very much. Let me just get my slides on the screen for us here. Share. And I believe you can see them now, right?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Yes, so I'm pleased to be here. So Ida Johnsson is one of my former colleagues, and so I'm more than happy to be here. And she helped me through the PhD program, and now I'm excited to be here and present with you guys what I think is an exciting group, something she's told me about. And hopefully a topic that's interesting. So we're looking at well-being, which is my main focus, but then how we can use maybe big data to derive some statistics on it that can be useful for national statistics organizations like my own, but also more broadly than that. You can see from the title, some of that in detail, from tweets to well-being, and we're going to use sentiment analysis and then apply that to the COVID-19 pandemic throughout 2020 in several countries, which I'll get to. It's joint work with Francesco Saracino, Talita Grayling, Chiara Peroni, and Stephanie Rosso. With that, we'll get started with some context. Looking at first, happiness in the United States. So if you were to think about what happened in 2020, what do you think it looks like compared to this broader span of time, 1973 to 2020? Excuse me. You can see here that it basically went off a cliff. This whole span of time, happiness really dived. Prior to this period, the lowest score was in 2010 during the middle of the financial crisis. But you see there, it was still above 25% of people reporting very happy, while in 2020, this was below 15%. There is a discontinuity, I must admit here, but nonetheless, this meaning the surveys are slightly different, but you can see still there's just this huge change. And what are we actually measuring here? This is happiness taken from the following question. Taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you are very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? So this question does have some limitations, as you can imagine. There's only 3 response options. So we're just focusing on the percent very happy, but it does give us this really long time horizon. And it has some other positive characteristics, which we can come to at some point later. But so that's getting us started. 2020 was a bad year. But then you might ask, all right, well, why do we care about happiness, in a pandemic? Well, I hope I don't have to say very much to say that happiness is important. But it's also something that was recognized by the World Health Organization. So here you see in Italy during the beginning of the pandemic, people singing, dancing, and sharing music from their balconies in Italy. And the lockdown was particularly harsh there. You weren't allowed to go more than, I think it was about, 100 yards from your house initially. And so this was something that, and we still use this term, social distancing, but here they're not socially distancing to the extent that they can avoid it. They're actually interacting with each other. They are maintaining physical distance, but interacting with each other as much as possible, partially to find a way to cope with the pandemic. So the World Health Organization recognized this and changed their recommendation. So we're intended to use not the term social distancing anymore, but physical distancing to recognize how important social interactions are for our mental health. And mental health and social well-being are actually part of the constitution of the World Health Organization. So it's a recognized input to overall health. So health is important and happiness is part of that. But there are also extrinsic benefits of happiness. We can take the following quote here from Google. At Google, we know that health, family, and well-being are an important aspect of Googlers' lives. We've also noticed that employees who are happy demonstrate increased motivation. We work to ensure that Google is an emotionally healthy place to live. So you can see here that Google seems to care about the well-being of their employees, but not just because it's good for their employees, but also because they see that there's going to be increased motivation. This is going to improve their bottom line. And Google's not wrong. If you look at a portfolio of the 100 best companies to work for in America, they earn 2.1% above industry benchmarks. This is based on some earlier analysis published here in 2011. And part of the reason is that happiness causally increases productivity. This was found in 3 different lab experiments that induce happiness, and then they measured productivity on tasks of cognitive challenging tasks. Happier people performed better. And part of the explanation is also coming from this theory by Barbara Fredrickson called broaden and build. And in it, she suggests that positive emotions allow people to broaden and build upon what they have. So it leads to greater creativity, idea generation, social bonds, and psychological resilience. And you can imagine, resilience being quite important in stressful work environments, deadlines, for example. And this has also now been tested quite a few times in the lab setting, typically done more in the psychology labs, but has been, as I recall, tested something like 60 plus times. So a substantial amount of research here as well. So we can see it now. I think that happiness is important, but for at least 2 reasons. So that's broadly. So what are we actually talking about today? So tweaks to well-being. So what is gross national happiness? So gross national happiness is a real-time measure of well-being that can be used by decision makers. And indeed, Statistics New Zealand, similar to my organization in Luxembourg, they've put this up on their website, and they now report gross national happiness from G&H in their COVID-19 data panel. So you can see it available there, a nice endorsement coming from a statistics organization, which, my working for one, I know that they have to have a significant amount of confidence in the statistics, because otherwise it impacts their credibility. And with lower credibility, then we have, significant issues, which I think you can imagine immediately, thinking about the FDA in the US or the World Health Organization or, the CDC and how that can impact people's behavior. So it's important. The G&H was initiated by Talita Grayling and Stephanie Rosso originally from South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. And then this paper is part of a funded project which expanded this to include the additional countries, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, France, Spain, Italy. So what I'm presenting here today is the first paper, and then I'm going to, with time, present part of the second paper. And we also added some variables. So G&H is the main one we're interested in, but then there are additional emotional variables, which we'll discuss briefly. And then economic fear, trust in national institutions, and loneliness. Those are brand new for this project, which are also generated in the same way, but I won't discuss in much detail unless they come up in Q&A. And the way that these are generated is coming from sentiment analysis, which we'll discuss now. So sentiment analysis uses natural language processing to process the text and an algorithm to determine whether the piece of writing exhibits a positive, negative, or neutral sentiment. You can look at the following sentence and think about how you would rate this. So this is a reviewer of a restaurant, and he says, everything tastes like garbage to me, but we keep coming back because my wife loves the pasta. So if you were to look at this, you might think, all right, so a basic algorithm would pick up the words like and loves and think positive. But we're actually doing something a bit further, and like garbage, right? Clearly that sounds more negative. And here is an example from a recursive neural tensor tree. It's not exactly what we're using, but it helps illustrate the point. So if you start at the very bottom here, you have the pasta. That's a neutral sentiment. Loves is positive, and you can start going up the tree as you put these together. So you're trying to capture the context in which the words are in. So like garbage, right? So then like is no longer treated positively if you go here towards the middle apart, and is considered negative. And it's considered so negative that it's going to dominate the overall stream, and this tweet would be considered negative. So then we look at all the tweets in a country in a given day, and we aggregate them up as positive, negative, or neutral, and we come up with a scale, put this on a scale from 0 to 10. So this sort of thing has been done in the past, in different ways, right? So back in 2011, there's a paper here where Twitter predicts stock market movement, another where they talk about electoral predictions. So this one's saying the limits of electoral predictions, but the author has another one talking about where and when it can be done as well. So it's not just limits, but possibilities. Also, you are what you tweet, analyzing Twitter for public health. So they're talking about influenza trends here. So quite a few possibilities, not just in, well-being, happiness type research that I'm talking about here. More recently, people have been exploiting Google Trends as well. So this was recently published in the Journal of Public Economics. There's some limitations here too. So they look at people searching for things like boredom, stress, and it's unclear what those mean. It does make us think, though, if they're searching less for boredom, that they are less bored, but at the same time, it's a little bit difficult to interpret. So, one of the things that we do that's a little bit better is we're going to try to validate our measures to provide some additional, confidence in what they mean. But nonetheless, this was, an important set of findings, which was recently published. For a broader set of background information, what I recommend is a chapter in the recent handbook. It's actually the physical copy is still being produced, but you can find it online, on big data and happiness. And this was written by two of our co-authors. So they discuss a lot of these other papers and some of the positives and negatives of using big data for happiness research, as well as not just happiness, but say electoral predictions, stock market. Altogether, these studies kind of suggest that big data can provide valid and reliable information. But as I mentioned, I'm going to come back to this in a little bit more detail later. So what does it look like during the pandemic? What happened? So here is the data for 7 European countries. This is the average. So across the left, we have the gross national happiness. I mentioned it's on a 0 to 10 scale. And across the bottom, you have the whole year of 2020. The table here on the right provides some of the detail. So you see, right away, this massive drop that happened in March. So it's actually just in a period of 9 days, we lost more than a full point of G&H. And then, which is rather large. So if you're unfamiliar with this, happiness literature, becoming unemployed is one of the statistics that we're quite confident in, and its impact on well-being, and that usually has about a half a point. But if you've become unemployed before, you know that is pretty significant. So this was at the population as a whole, right? It's almost as if they all became unemployed overnight. So as what was happening is, especially in the U.S. context, we had social unrest, we had unemployment, we had fear of the pandemic. So this seems to make sense. But then what's a bit surprising perhaps is how quickly people recovered. So people seem to show a lot of resilience, and there is some psychological research to support that. But we'll maybe come to that in Q&A. And then as the pandemic continued, I think if you're like me, I thought it wasn't going to last as long as it has. But as it starts to last longer and longer, G&H starts to decline. And it hits another negative here towards the end of October. And actually, at the end of 2020, we have a similar level of G&H as at the beginning. And I think part of that is a little bit the anticipation of the holiday season, which a lot of people really take off in Europe. And then, of course, we had vaccines announced at the end of the year as well. So just looking at this in a little bit more detail with some potential variables, the same figure, but then layered in the new cases. So you see that G&H seems to anticipate the first wave of new cases. And then it seems to correspond pretty well. The minimum here corresponds pretty well with the peak here. And note that what's quite interesting, again, this is Europe, so it's a bit different than how the cases were dispersed throughout the United States. But the second wave was much larger. And yet we still had, I think, more fear probably back during this period, because we didn't know as much of what was going on. But at the same time, here you have lockdown measures. So these it's an index of containment and health policy measures. And you see that it spikes during this period in the beginning of March. It was a little bit earlier in Italy, a little bit behind in, say, France, Luxembourg, Germany, but they're all kind of coming in together here and really corresponding with this. So this is a signal coming from the government saying, there's something to be worried about, but also it's limiting our freedoms we're having to stay at home. But then after, it doesn't seem like there's much correlation anymore. G&H really comes back up, whereas containment policies are still somewhat level. And G&H starts to decline again, completely unrelated to the containment policies, it would seem. Whereas it does seem that new cases are related. So, of course, we can do more than just look at the data. We can do some regressions. Here, to give you a sense of what we're looking at, we have it's 10 countries. We've got 51 weeks because we're missing, because we have a lag G&H. So we've got the full year, but then -1 for the lag. And so we have an auto-regressive regression here. And you see a huge amount of persistence. So the best predictor of most things is its lag. And that's true here as well. But then you have the seasons. So spring, people are happier than in the winter, which is the omitted variable here. Summer, actually no difference, which is perhaps a little surprising. A lot of people went on holiday though, and they weren't necessarily tweeting from their local places. Fall, things seem to improve. All right, and then some additional variables here. So the IHS stands for the inverse hyperbolic spline. So it's basically just log cases. So this is the change in log cases. Residential mobility, this is coming from Google. This is the data on people's mobility. In this case, people staying at home. And then stringency, that's the same measure I had before, but we're allowing it here to be asymmetric. So a decrease or an increase in stringency can be treated differently. And this is the forward or the lead. So most of the time, changes in policy were announced before they were implemented, and a lot of times a week in advance. So you see also that we're explaining a huge amount of the variation. It's over 80% of the variation just with these variables. Also, to mention month, a lot of the transmission of COVID was coincident in these countries, especially Luxembourg, France, Belgium, Germany. So it's really closely located. Italy's a little different. The UK is a little different. So the month controls actually absorb quite a lot. But it's important to try to capture that, to isolate the other relationships. Here we just add them in sequentially. New cases, statistically significant, negative, as we would expect. Cases go up, people are less happy. People here on this third column, a little bit surprising. People staying at home, they're happier. It was surprising to me at first, although if you think about it, the main movement in time, because this is relative, is when you're working from home. And we have other data that suggests that people, at least initially, really like to work from home. So this is perhaps not as surprising as I thought. Stringency, this one's a bit surprising. So if you anticipate a decrease in stringency, you have a decrease in G&H, or happiness. That was unexpected. Thankfully, at least the increase is larger. So there is a larger decrease, but it seems to suggest people just don't like change. However, this is going to go away as we add some more variables in the next slide. Column 5 just puts it all together. Column 6 is just a change. So we have a change in the amount of variables here based on residential mobility is not available in the month of January and the first week of February. So it's really just kind of getting us back to our initial level of observations to say it's not super sensitive to that. So this is kind of the main set of results. And then what we do is add in here the emotional variables, which I mentioned. Before mentioning those, though, note here that the persistence declines a little bit. So we're starting to explain more of what's happening in G&H, which is helpful from a policymaker. Persistence doesn't help a policymaker very much. And then the stringency here, now it becomes statistically insignificant. So the magnitude hasn't changed very much, so it's still suggestive, but at least it's not statistically significant. So we get more of the anticipated relationship, which is, again, an increase in the stringency of policies, increase in lockdown measures reduces your happiness. And then we add in the emotional variables I mentioned. So there's 8 here, kind of covering a broad range. So you might think, let's say, fear or anger are the most important. So we're quite fearful during the beginning, or angry when they change policies on, let's say, containment lockdown policies. But in fact, most of these are maintaining their significance. So cases are still significant. Mobility doesn't change. In fact, it becomes a little bit more, the magnitude increases. And then, but as you can imagine, also, there's some collinearity here. So what we do is we sequentially go through removing the least significant one until we get basically a p-value of above 0.4 and to remove collinearities. So now surprise reveals itself, disgust reveals itself as being the most important. And then trust. We kind of expected trust to be more important earlier on. So it's one of the most important aspects of well-being generally. It's an indicator of social capital. So you think about, the more trusting you are, generally it proxies well for the better, how good your relationships are. And that's, very important part of that. The economic fear, national trust, and loneliness, these are variables that we were really excited about. They haven't been created before. So what we did with economic fear is we took the tweets that particularly related to the economy. And we can think of this as potentially proxying for unemployment, but in a real-time way, how people feel or perceive the job market and also their income. So this was something we were excited about, but unfortunately didn't show up the way we thought. And also we were unable to produce it for Luxembourg because the tweets on the economy were just too few to get a reliable measure. National trust, loneliness also didn't show up. So we'll keep working with these, but right now it seems that they don't show up. And you can also think of this as a little bit as a placebo, because these are generated in the same way that G&H is generated or the emotions are generated. And so if it was that this was significantly related just because of some artifact in the way it's produced, well, then we would see the relationship here as well. So it provides some confidence in what we're finding. Kind of summarize these results. So we see large.
Kelsey,
Yeah.
if I may interrupt here, there's a question from the audience. What are the questions you use to measure trust, and are there any subcategories for trust?
Yeah, okay, great. Nice question. So in fact, trust is coming from the sentiment analysis as well. So we're not using questions for trust. And then the subcategories are basically, we just have this trust in national institutions, which is based on the set of tweets, but then the set of tweets that only have keywords relating to national trusts. So it's a subset of the tweets and then trust related to that. I have a figure at the end, which I can help to look at to illustrate the different emotions. So trust is one of the emotions that we use sentiment analysis to come up with. So it's going to look at the tweet like we looked at before, and it was just rated positive, negative, or neutral. But then we have an algorithm that instead is going to try to measure the amount of trust, or in other cases for other emotions, the amount of anger, the amount of sadness that is being illustrated in the being revealed in this tweet. So it's sentiment analysis. It's based on this machine learning process in the same way, but just more specific. So the general summary here is that so we see some large swings in G&H. They occur rapidly in March. And more than 80% of the variation throughout 2020 can be explained by just the persistence of log G&H, the seasons of the year, and also month controls. Increasing new cases and anticipated increases in the severity of lockdown measures are related to lower G&H, as you would expect. People appear to like staying at home. This is based on the Google mobility data, which is positively associated with G&H. And the most important emotions that are measured are disgust, surprise, and trust. Surprisingly, our variables, economic fear, trust in national institutions, and loneliness were not associated. Keep track of time here. Okay, so for the robustness of the findings, so it's a little bit different than your typical paper, because the most important thing is whether or not we believe that the G&H data themselves are valid and reliable. So we talked about this before, and so what I specifically mean is, does G&H consistently reflect the aggregate mood of a nation? And first indications, there's 5 papers that are published or forthcoming using this measure, and that. In order to be published, they need to get past, at least 10 2 referees per paper. So at least 10 referees have essentially signed off saying that we believe this contains meaningful information. However, that's only one indication. And these papers are based in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So what we're going to do is perform some additional tests. So for the traditional measures of happiness and subjective well-being, we're going to start there to give you a sense. And those traditional measures use a question like the following, similar to what I showed you at the beginning. And note here that with the highlighted part, so all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? So it's not just your emotional state, but asking you to think more broadly. And then we pull from the OECD guidelines on measuring subjective well-being. So this is put out in 2013 for national statistics offices, but also say researchers more generally. And they reveal, basic tests that we should implement and some of the results of what has been done in the past. As an example, so if you were to answer this question yourself, then say an expert, say like a therapist or your partner, would provide a similar rating. Also, subjective well-being is determined by and predicts objective outcomes. So I have a paper where I use subjective well-being to predict unemployment. So happier people are less likely to be unemployed, just to give you an example. Happy people are more likely to get married, as another example. There's also biomarkers. So we put people in brain scans or MRIs, and the results there. So activity in the prefrontal cortex is associated with greater subjective well-being. So this is the kind of stuff that's been done in the past. And so generally it's considered that these measures are reliable and valid. I'm mostly focusing on validity. If you want to talk about reliability, we'll discuss that more in Q&A. It's a slightly nuanced version of validity. Validity covers most of it. So to give you a sense of our results, here you have G&H across the left, and it's just a cross-sectional, and life satisfaction coming from a survey across the bottom, and 7 of our countries for which we have these data. And it's at the same period of time. So the correlation is not great. It's just a rank correlation. It's not statistically significant. It's a little bit better when we exclude Italy. But, again, we only have 7 observations, and, we aren't measuring exactly the same thing. Life satisfaction and G&H aren't exactly the same thing, although they do point to, let's say, subjective well-being. They are different measures of subjective well-being. And we have several additional tests here. Across the top, first, you have another correlation that is cross-sectional, also insignificant, but it's a higher correlation, which is a little bit better. Cantrell ladder, it's another kind of subjective measure of well-being. We have a little bit more observations in countries here. The one real downside to our results is this one here. So we find a negative correlation, insignificant, however, when we expect a positive. So this is, again, life satisfaction. They should move together. However, this is for a smaller set of countries, and the life satisfaction itself is coming from a non-representative survey. So we don't have full confidence in this measure anyway. Here we look at searches for negative emotions using the Google Trends, similar to that other paper. So we look at, in this case, it's anger, sadness, and fear, kind of aggregate that. And then we can look at it over time as one of the benefits of this, and provide an indication of, let's say, a negative measure of well-being. And indeed, we do find a negative, although again, insignificant relationship. And we're able to look at this for all of our countries over 12 months. Another relationship, insignificant, again, small number of observations. And we look at consumer confidence. So you've all heard of it, and it's pretty easily available, and it's actually monthly. So that's fairly nice, although we are missing one variable, so one country. But consumer confidence, you might think, all right, that's not really a measure of well-being. It seems to be more related to economic fear, right? Economic fear and consumer confidence probably measure opposite concepts. And in fact, here the correlation is statistically significant and negative, as we would expect. And then when we look at trust in national institutions, trust in government. So this trust in government here is coming from a survey. Trust in national institutions is coming from our sentiment analysis derived. Here we've got almost perfect correlation, although again, this is rank correlation. So it's not quite the same. And then again, another good positive and significant relationship when we look at more closely aligned measures. So these are supposed to measure the same thing: trust in others, trust in national institutions, trust in government. These should measure basically the same thing, and these are more closely aligned, and then indeed we do get a little bit better. So overall, we consider that we do have a meaningful level of correlation with these different measures of subjective well-being. This kind of represents kind of convergent validity. And then also, if you just looked at our results for over 2020, the variation in G&H is explained by the factors we would expect, the COVID infection rates, lockdown measures. And this represents another form of validity that they talk about called construct validity. So we do think that we have some meaningful information there. And then I think I have a little bit of time here that we will talk about the extension. So this is part of the second paper. So I mentioned that trust is an important component of subjective well-being. And it's not just a component of subjective well-being, however, though, it represents, its own, important aspects. So you think about, trust in the CDC or Center for Disease Control or the FDA during 2020, and that dramatically influenced our behavior. And indeed, we're seeing that sort of result in our analysis. So it's using trust derived in the same sort of way that we derive G&H, and we see some positives. And this also suggests that the data are valuable in an entirely different way. So they're predictive of things that we care about. So suggesting that they're valid and important for people to understand and measure. I was going to click on that, excuse me. There we go. To show you the data, first, how is compliance measured? So one of the things we actually innovate here is you have the staying at home measure coming from Google again. And then you have the policy stringency. This is coming, that index from Oxford. And you see at the beginning, there's a nice correlation, but then the correlation starts to fade. Here it's, at its weakest part. So it slows down here. Yeah. And so the way in which we measure compliance then is really just the correlation essentially between these two curves. But we're going to do it by country and every month. Here you can see the results. We have compliance here in red, the original stringency measure. And you see that, compliance starts off higher in the year, not surprising, and it starts to decline throughout the year. This blip is a little bit surprising, but part of the analysis. And so you see that we were at our lowest level of compliance here in the middle of the year. And it's important to note so that it wasn't the same. So if you were to think of different political organizations, and their influence, a lot of times we think that they are one group and that they stay the same all the time. Here, behavior changes throughout the year and is different in different countries. So it's an important change to what we knew before, because we didn't know how it changed before. And then we show that trust predicts it. So this is similar analysis as before. So we have lag trust, lag compliance here in the second regression, and then the number of cases. So we see as trust increases in a country, then we have greater compliance. As cases increase, also you can imagine that people are more compliant. They're going to follow the rules more as well when they're more worried about becoming infected. This significance goes away when we throw in lag compliance, but it's back when we have fixed effects. So you might remember results from English and Pischke that you can't do both of these at the same time. You can't do lag compliance and fixed effects at the same time because it causes what's called nickel bias. And they say that, in fact, these bound the true estimate. So the true estimate should be somewhere in between these. However, what you can do is you can do instrumental variable analysis to predict these various variables, and then you can do lags and fixed effects at the same time. So in these next two regressions, we have fixed effects and lagged compliance included. And here the relationship is statistically significant in the direction we expect. So, with the exception, this one's a little bit larger, but otherwise this does fall nicely in the middle. This is a standard two-stage least squares. The excluded variables. So each of these are treated as endogenous variables, and their changes. So the excluded variable is just the twice lagged value of trust, twice lagged value of compliance. In this case, it's going to be the once lagged. And then in the Ariane bond, if you know that, it's this dynamic panel. So it uses, exploits further lags. And so it's typically not as stable. There's the reason why we use both in the smaller samples. But so we show that, greater trust is correlated with, or in this case, if you want to push it, you would say that this is a causal analysis. Although we can be more cautious or prudent and just say greater trust predicts greater compliance. So if we had better messaging coming from our leaders instilling trust in government, we would have greater compliance. And that brings us to the conclusion. So the 2020 decline in reported well-being was unprecedented in the United States. This was that first slide I showed you at the beginning. However, that was based on a survey that was conducted in May of 2020. It doesn't really represent the whole year. So you can see again that we had a fairly large fluctuation in Europe at least, and we don't have the same data in the United States. So the G&H allows us to observe a much more refined picture, which was quite important during this period of time. So if you were to look just here, you would say that everything's terrible, but you look here and you think everybody's resilient. But in fact, it's a bit more than that. So we do observe some resilience, but it's not permanent. As the as the pandemic continued, people's G&H declines, and this is as I mentioned before, an important magnitude to have basically, this is like the entire country becoming unemployed at the same time. All right, thanks very much. That is it. I'm open to questions.
So I guess while we wait for questions to come in from the audience, I wanted to ask you, have you seen any kind of meaningful country heterogeneity in your analysis, both in terms of the impact of the pandemic and then also the second part in terms of response to policies? So, and I'm thinking about Scandinavia versus Latin countries, probably very different.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I should have included a slide here, just looking at the G&H for the different countries. So you do see variation across the countries. Although there is a lot of consistency, the better way to see it in this analysis is actually that we have the three other countries, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. So, we don't have Sweden, as you know, they didn't have lockdown, at least not initially. And then we have major changes, and also the Netherlands. And, so some of these countries we're missing. Latin America, we don't have. But Australia and New Zealand, right, as islands, they had very significant lockdown. They had very low levels of cases. And so they had a fairly harsh decline in well-being that occurred around the beginning of the pandemic. They bounced back, but then they didn't have the same decline that Europe had afterwards. So I think it seems to be related to the number of cases. So it's, if I speak to my colleagues, they're still quite disappointed with the number of lockdowns, especially into 2021. Unfortunately, we don't have the 2021 data. But by the end of 2020, they were at somewhat similar levels as they were at the beginning of the year. And I think partially that's reflecting the number of cases that they had there, and then some resilience. They seem to be able to bounce back. So.
And then I guess the other kind of heterogeneity we could be interested in is between different social groups, right? Like people who can work remotely versus people who can't. I don't know if that's possible to distinguish in the data or.
Yeah, so, in this data, we're looking at the country as a whole. So unfortunately, we're unable to do that. We do have, I had some work done in Luxembourg looking at, by age as an example, gender, different groups for sure. Yeah, so you do know, in stylized facts coming from the media, there's a major difference for those who can work from home versus those who cannot. What is perhaps most interesting, coming not just from the stylized facts, is the youth are the ones who are being impacted the most, at least initially. So the elderly, I think, probably have better coping strategies. We're not also reliant upon meeting friends in person as much. They have more dependent upon their nuclear families. So you have, different set of outcomes there. But it's not necessarily what we'd expect initially, because you would think that people would be fearful for their own lives first, and they're more at risk. But as we observed in the data, not from the data presented today, the youth are actually more impacted, let's say, by the restrictions that they faced.
And so when you say youth, how young, of a cohort, can we meaningfully measure here?
Yeah, so typically what we're going to be looking at, the survey is going to start maybe as young as 15, generally for the general population surveys. So I think my analysis, I had 18 to 34. And, I think 18 to 26, it was more extreme. So I think that what I published, I think I did 18 to 34, but at one point I looked at even younger, or like a smaller slice of that. And the younger you went, the worse it was. And so there are studies looking at adolescents, but they're smaller in number. The general population, we're going to start with more like 18 or occasionally 16, 15, 16. Yeah.
Is it possible to measure well-being of young children?
Yeah. So, what's interesting here too is, this is actually revealed, right? So this sentiment you could potentially do the same thing. So you could take, training data. So we have an external expert decide, all right, so a young person is communicating in this way at the level in which they're communicating, right? So they have to be able to write, let's say, if they're communicating sentiment. And then you could train new machine learning programs, and then you would have to validate it. That's, I don't think, been done, but there's some research, for example, saying that young people, children as young as 5 years old, understanding the meaning of loneliness. So they conceptually, they understand a lot more than sometimes what we think. But these scales, these measures of well-being are generally validated for adults. So we do have, we're going to place less confidence in the way in which just kind of naturally, because we're paternalistic coming from our, we're talking about our kids here. We're paternalistic, believing that they don't really understand very much. They are not able to respond on their own. So you're going to get oftentimes, let's say, teacher or parent ratings of young people's well-being. And I think in this case, though, most of the kids are extremely resilient, and they have their parents around them most of the time, unless they've lost them to COVID directly. But so I think in general, the really young are probably not going to be impacted as much, except for being able to go to school. When you talk about that, that's huge, and that's going to have lasting impacts that we don't yet understand. Yeah. I don't see a lot of questions, but that's okay.
Yeah, I have a few more questions, but yeah, if anyone in the audience has questions, please put them in the chat box. So I'm thinking going forward, it seems that the pandemic is bringing some kind of lasting changes to how society works, right? And I think primarily leveraging remote technologies, which will reduce, hopefully permanently, right, some things like commuting or people being able to spend more time with their kids. So I would hypothesize that might kind of have lasting effects on happiness. So I'm curious about your thinking, going forward, how to measure this, and general research projects to see what the pandemic has some like really meaningful changes in society that shift well-being.
Well, so I'm going to give you a slightly broader answer. I was interviewing for an advisory position, I think it was a year ago. And at that point, I said that, the skills transformation more broadly is going to, in fact, impact us more than the pandemic. I thought the pandemic wasn't going to last as long. What I mean by the skills transformation, I mean, the number of jobs that can be replaced by machine learning now, right? So paralegals, for example. And so, the work of David Otter talks about, the number of jobs that can be replaced, and we have creative destruction. So it's quite difficult. You guys are the ones, creating some of these new jobs. So I think that the pandemic just escalated this. So it really put it on, it made us more comfortable working with Zoom. Years and years ago, there was a discussion about how do we deal with climate change. And one of the suggestions at the time was that we need to work more remotely, but frankly, people don't want to work remotely. And, they do and they don't. Let me say that they don't want to meet remotely, because you don't have the same level of interaction, and managers don't want their employees working remotely. So this forced us to work remotely. And then we realized that we could, and oftentimes that we like it. And so that it was it was an equilibrium shift. It was a shock that was large enough to shift the equilibrium, which would have been difficult for us to obtain otherwise. So I think it was, it just really escalated what was going to change anyway. And then, so part of your other point, so future research, I think what's important is to understand how this may have changed our view of the world. So say we, fit machine learning algorithms to bad training data because we viewed the world in a different way. It's not just that, so the relationships that we understood from old papers in the 1980s and 90s or whatever. I can give you a specific example. So there's this happy productive worker theory. So initially, the research didn't find a correlation between happiness and productivity. But that's changed starting in the 2000s. Because previously, a lot of the jobs were more manufacturing oriented. And now that they require more creativity and autonomy, happiness is a positive contributor. I'm speculating a little bit on the reason why, but the change in time, I know for certain. So we've got a paradigm shift, which is going to require us to think differently. And you guys who are in the business, right, those who can think about the future are going to be the ones who are going to do the best. If we hold tight to what had been the past, you're going to fail.
That's interesting perspective. Thank you.
No.
So yeah, are there any questions? I guess last chance for the audience. Otherwise, we're gonna wrap up here.
Yep. So previous to doing this research, I was working as a consultant, and then chose to leave that arena to focus on research, and that's been a good thing for me. But yeah, it also means that I have a little bit of the perspective of what's happening in the workplace. The amount of hours that people are working, and part of the challenge right now, right, is working from home makes it difficult to separate out, your workspace and normal working hours. BlackBerries did that initially. I had one of those old brick BlackBerries, and now we just have, tech in our Slack in our face all the time. So that's a challenge that we'll have to create some boundaries on. In Germany, you have some cases where it's automatically turned off. So you get essentially, it's kind of like an out of office message that chimes in. I think it's at 6, maybe it's even earlier. They often start their day earlier. So there'll be some balance necessary, but I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon in the US, if at all.
Yeah. Well, it seems that I'm curious, for this research on happiness, do you intersect it with like research on personality types? Because what has become apparent, like from just my experience, is that different personality types, right, handle the situation differently. For some people, it's like perfect. And for some people, they see challenges like the ones you mentioned.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We have a better understanding of that now. So the main we look at are the big 5 personality traits, right? But introversion, extroversion is one of those. And generally speaking, our relation, that what we understand about it is, let's say, kind of cross-sectional. It's not always, causal, right? So how are you going to, experimentally change somebody's personality? So there's some limitations to the research, and I think not much has been done yet with COVID. I think there's probably one paper, but I suspect you're right, and unfortunately I can't give you the answer. Sort of like extroversion, I would guess is going to be, more of a challenge for people who are staying at home. The more extroverted you are. Neurotic, I've seen, as an example, neurotic play a role for people, the amount of media that you read. So more news translates, it's not a causal relate, it's just a relationship. The more news you read, the less happy you are. And I think that's partially related to neuroticism. The other word we use for neuroticism is just emotional instability. So you're fearful, worried, constantly reading the news. And there's a lot of research now talking about the negative bias in the news. So it also doesn't describe the reality accurately. It describes reality negatively to sell more, subscriptions. So there would be an interaction there, but I don't have the right research to show you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess last question. It seems like, would you say like in terms of like data limitations, the kind of what is the kind of data that you think would be the best to meaningfully answer these kinds of questions, and what does the availability look like of that kind of data?
Yeah, so one of the other projects that we did at my institute over this last year is we implemented a panel survey online. So the advantage in Luxembourg is that the internet penetration rate, I think, including smartphones, is like 98%. So it's huge. You're reaching, virtually everyone, and then you can ask surveys online much more cheaply than we were doing it before. A lot of times it's over the phone, and then you can conduct it weekly. So the advantage of this Twitter-based data is that we have it so regularly, and so it's frequently measured. And we also get the results quickly. If we could do the same, I think, with surveys, it would be better, because we could get nationally representative. We'd have the individual data so that we can look at differences by ethnic, social, demographic, economic, personality, all of these characteristics. So I think that those are the data that we need. And in some cases we have it. You might remember the guys at RAND and Caesar. So they have a nice survey. I think that's conducted monthly, if I remember right. And for the US, they do a better job of predicting US election outcomes, for example. So that one's a good one. And it's expensive to do this normally. And so the web panel would be an improvement.
Okay.
Yeah. And we wouldn't just use surveys, right? So it's we can pair that also with the economic data too, the more objective economic data.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's super interesting. Thank you, Kelsey, for joining, and thank you to all the participants. And I think with that, we will wrap up this seminar.
Yep. Thank you, Ida, for all your questions and the invitation.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. Very interesting. And thank you, Ida, for moderating. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Just as a reminder, we have a few other upcoming NABE webinars, including part 2 of our CBE webinar series, Economic Careers in Finance. And then we will have a labor market update in just 1 week on October 27th. We also have the holiday retail outlook coming up in November. All recordings of NABE webinars are available through the NABE Connect app. And we do have all of the posted recordings of webinars also on the NABE.com digital archive for members. Thank you all again. That does conclude the event. And thank you, Kelsey and Ida, again.